Welcome, I'm Albert, and today I'm going to show you how to make isometric game assets, like this little example here. These are perfect for city simulators, all sorts of RPGs, turn-based games, and many other things. Now, how does one go about making this using Stable Diffusion? Well, your first impulse might be to just prompt it, right? You can enter isometric game asset and generate some things. And if you were to do that, it would look pretty decent, right? You got the angle, you got kind of that classic isometric look that you might know from your favorite games. But if you really look at them in detail, you will very quickly realize that these are not all from the same perspective. You can see here, down here, the perspective is a little lower, this is a little higher. So if you were to place these straight images into a game, they would not be compatible with each other at all. We would need extra control to make usable isometric game assets. Perfect, because we just got a great set of tools called ControlNet that helps us steer Stable Diffusion to the results we want. What I'm going to do with it today is I'm going to use the depth model to create these assets. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to show you how to use Blender to create a vague shape for the asset you want by rendering this depth map and then inputting that into ControlNet to create your final asset. Now, this is just one example. You can use this technique to create a great many different options, or even a completely different style. This doesn't have to be a city simulator. I also use this technique to make this little fantasy game mockup here. Let's get started. What do we need for it? Well, the most important thing is, of course, an installation of Stable Diffusion. I'm using the Auto 1111 interface. Now, in order to install this, if you haven't already, click the link in the description and play around with it a little bit to learn the ins and outs of Stable Diffusion. Maybe check out my other tutorials and come back when you have a firm grasp of prompting and these settings here. Next, you're going to, of course, need the ControlNet extension. Now, the best way to install this is you go to your Extensions tab, install from URL, and take this URL, which I also have in the description, copy it, paste it in here, and click Install. After you've done that, you go to your Installed tab and just have to click this little checkbox here, SD WebUI ControlNet, and apply and restart UI. Now, once you've done that, your UI will reset and you will have a new tab down here in both the text-to-image and image-to-image tabs that enable ControlNet. And you'll have these extra settings here. But we also need the ControlNet models. So for that, we go to this link, also in the description, and download the depth model, control_depth.safetensor. So just click on that and download it, and also make sure to download these YAML files too. And then next, you go to your Stable Diffusion WebUI folder, Extensions, SD WebUI ControlNet, Models, and drop your downloaded depth model into here. As you see, I've already done that. Now, if you want to follow along exactly with today's tutorial, I also recommend getting the Ayonimix Model because it's very, very pretty. It's a great way to get attractive results quickly. I'm using version 5. So you download that, and you also need a VAE. So you click this VAE link here, download that. And what you do with those files is in your main UI folder, as any other model, you go to the Models folder, Stable Diffusion, and drop your Ayonimix model in here and your VAE in the VAE folder. And next, if you want your VAE options up here, make sure you go to Settings, User Interface, Quick Settings list, and add SD_VAE to this list. And apply settings and reload UI, and then you'll have the exact settings I do right here. Before we even get into Stable Diffusion, we're going to open up Blender because Blender will let us define the shape of the buildings we want and get that perfect isometric angle that we need to have, consistent assets for our game. Now, first of all, of course, we're making an isometric game, so the perspective is going to be very flat. We're not going to have lines converging in the distance like this. You're not going to have kind of this wide angle view, right? You can see things further away are kind of angled away, like perspective, which we don't want. So if we go into our default camera and select it, we can go to our camera settings, the object data properties down here, and change the type to orthographic. And you'll immediately see it goes flat like this, which is what we need. Now, I looked it up. Isometric angles, games like this usually have an angle of about 30 to 45 degrees. So I think our camera is pretty solid there to the ground. It's one of those angles. But if we want to change it, we can also just press N to get into this tab, select View, and lock the camera to view. And that way we can adjust our angle a little bit like this. And with Shift and middle mouse click, we can move our perspective around like this. Or we select it and we can rotate around our cube like this. But I kind of like the angle as it is. This is pretty good, so we can keep it like that. Now next, of course, you're noticing we're creating a non-square rectangle, so we want to change that as well. We go into our output properties and turn the resolution up to 2048 by 2048. Now the reason we're making such a big square is because we want some resolution in our depth map for a step I'm going to show you later when we're editing our images and want to cut them out. So just follow along with this. You don't need giant render power on your computer to do this because we're only giving ourselves depth information. The materials or anything don't matter, so don't worry about that. And now next, I am going to create a grid. So you're going to delete your default cube and Shift A, mesh a plane into here. This is going to be, as you can see here, 2 by 2 meters by default. Now what we want to do is create a larger plane that covers the whole thing. So we're going to S and scale by 8. So it covers all or most of our image here. Now next, we want to subdivide this by a couple times. So we're going to go into our modifier properties and add a subdivision surface modifier and give this a amount of 4. Make sure it's also in render, also 4 in render. And we change this to simple so it remains a square. Now why am I doing this? Because in the next step, I'm adding a wireframe modifier which will reveal all of these new faces we've created with the previous modifier. You can lower the thickness a little bit, just turn it way down so you can just barely see the lines here. Now, this is an easy way to create a grid. Now, we don't want to render this every single time, so I'm going to turn off the disable it renders, just so we can see it a little more clearly than kind of the default grid that we have in Blender. And now, what do we do in Blender? Well, we are going to create very rough versions of the buildings we want. Now, you don't have to worry too much about details in this. I'm going to create a few default buildings that we need as assets. So I'm going to Shift A and create a new cube, bring it up to the floor by going GZ1. So now we have it on top of our grid on the floor, and tab into edit mode. Now, I think I'm going to create a family home for now, kind of a nice little villa that we want. Remember to turn off your view lock before you navigate or your camera is going to move around. So I'm going to create kind of a luxurious home, very roughly. This is where you kind of need your basic Blender skills. With Control R, you can loop cut like this, and you don't have to worry about your topography or any of those advanced 3D things. This is really just going to be a rough estimation, so Stable Diffusion knows what we want. Now, I think I'm going to put my entrance. Good, so here's our basic house. If you want, you can adjust the camera a little more to make it a little more central. If your camera happens to do weird stuff like that, it's because if you roll the middle mouse wheel while you're in this view with the orthographic camera, it can do strange things. As you can see, it's really close to the house now. To fix that, you go outside, your camera view, and GZZ, and you can move the camera away like this again to not have it be so close. If it changes anything in this view, you also have this scale here, orthographic scale in your camera settings, which is basically like a zoom. So if you want to go further away, you can increase the scale, and closer, you decrease it. But the way we have it is just fine. And just make sure your building is fully within view of the camera. Next, now if you just render this straightforward, it's going to look like a bad render, right? The lighting's all wrong and there's no textures, and this information is useless. What you need is a depth map. So in the next step, we're going to go into the compositing tab, click Use Nodes. Now I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. This can be a little overwhelming, but don't worry about it. You need to have your depth information in your composite output. Where do you get this depth information? Well, you go into your layer properties and select the Z in data, and now you'll immediately see suddenly you're getting depth out of your render layers, which is what you need. And now you Shift A and search for a normalize node, plug your depth into there, and Shift A, an invert node, and plug that normalize node into the color information. And now the final thing, you plug this color into your image. What normalize does is it makes the point closest to your camera pure white and the point furthest away pure black. So you always have maximum possible depth information for your scene, which is what you need. And the invert just inverts that because Stable Diffusion uses the opposite colors. So black for white, white for black. It's that simple. Now if you press render, you will suddenly get a perfect depth map. And this you can save and input into ControlNet. So we're going to do precisely that. And we stay very clean with our naming. So we're going to call this house depth. PNG is fine. RGB is fine. You don't have any transparency, so you don't need A. Color depth, leave it. And save your image. And now we can go into Stable Diffusion. The first thing to do before we forget is, of course, to put our new depth map into ControlNet. So down here in the Auto 1111 WebUI is our ControlNet tab, and we only need one control model here. So ignore the other tabs. If you don't have them, also fine. And click here and drop your house depth image in here. Now we can enable, and we don't need a preprocessor, so you can ignore this because it's already a perfect depth map. So we just switch our model to control depth. Now the weight is a little high at 1. We do want Stable Diffusion to invent some details, so I'm going to put it down to 0.6 and we'll see how that goes. That's usually the amount that's fine to preserve all of these angles that we need for our isometric look. Regarding the prompt, I'm not going to read out this whole thing because it's a pretty long prompt, but here's a good one I figured out for this style of game. So you can just copy paste that from the description. This is your positive prompt. It just makes it kind of nice 3D render style, but also like a nice looking Flash game, which I enjoy. And as a negative prompt, you copy paste this in here, just some basics. Now, what do we want to do first? So I designed this as a family home, so I think I'm going to do that. So it's a villa with a red tile roof, maybe something Tuscany, but also modern architecture. We don't want to make it look too rustic. It's a building, just add some more details with windows, doors, and a garage. So kind of maybe weight that up so it understands that this is a big garage that we have here. And down here, sampling method Euler A is great. I can change it to DDIM sometimes if I want more out there results, which I enjoy, but today this is okay. Sampling steps 20 is fine for finding a style, and put your batch count up to 4. That's usually good. Everything else can remain the same. We're creating squares anyway. So now that that's set, let's try it out. Here we have our first results. So here it clearly missed the garage and the red tile roof. That's okay. This is very close to what I wanted. It's got the nice windows, the red roof, a nice door. It has kind of that Tuscan, warm, cozy vibe, which I really like. And these both missed the garage. So this is clearly the best one. And if I want, I can just adjust this to my heart's content, in-paint some parts, or send it to image and make a higher res version of it. So a really cool trick I learned from one of you, so thank you so much for commenting, is that I can actually send this to image and increase my width and height by much more. So I can put it double, like to 1024 if I want. And even my not too great GPU will process it if I set the denoising strength down to 2, because that way it's going to keep the style really well, but also add a bunch of details and make it look nice. This is a great step before you upscale to really get some more details in there. And I can turn my sampling steps up to 45, whatever I want. And in order to kind of keep this design, I'm also going to copy my seed over and bring it in there. And I can also add the same depth image to my ControlNet to not lose any of this information. Same settings as before. And here's the result. You can tell it's much, much cleaner because the sampling steps were higher and the resolution is much higher. And we still have a lot of this detail. The lantern got nicer, the window got nicer, and it's a really clean, high resolution result that we got without using an upscaler. So that's how we preserved all of these details. Really cool trick there. Now, what do we do with this? Well, we bring it into an image editing program of our choice. I'm going to use Affinity Photo. This is equally possible in Photoshop or GIMP, just with slightly different techniques. So I create a new file and make it the size of our results, so 1024 by 1024, and copy paste our results. So we copy our image, bring it in here. And of course, what I'm doing now is I want to cut this out. We're going to use it as a game asset in a game, right? I don't want all of this background and so forth, and I want it to match, ideally, my depth map perfectly. So I'm going to go get my depth map, bring it on over here, and this is why I made it such a high resolution. So we can resize it down to fit our canvas. And this is a great technique because we already have almost a perfect mask here. The only thing is that it has this light grayscale gradient. So we get rid of that by using the threshold filter, which in Affinity we get here, threshold, and just turn that way down. I do it down to 1%. And now you see we have a perfect outline of our house. So I'm going to rasterize to mask and immediately have an almost perfect cutout of our building. Now, it's not 100% perfect. We see some edges here that it got wrong, but it is an excellent way to get a rough cutout. We can adjust this if we want. Now, if you are using Photoshop, let's do that really quickly. It's just as easy. So you bring your stable diffusion result in here, then drag your depth map on top of it. It even resizes automatically. Enter, select that layer, make sure it's selected, go to Image, Adjustments, Threshold, drag the level way down. I find 3 is good for this. Press OK. Now select your image layer below, give it a mask, make sure your depth map layer is hidden. Select the mask, go to Image, Apply Image, and then select the layer House Depth, or your depth map. And it'll work immediately. You'll even get a nice preview. So here's our very first building asset that we have. But now is a really cool trick. We can just as easily use this same depth map to create literally anything else. For example, what's even forcing us to make this a home? We can also easily turn it into a hospital, for example. So hospital building, clinic, modern architecture. Let's do glass and steel. And just let the thing run with the exact same settings. And you immediately have a bunch of other cool options here. That's probably going to get cut out. But you see it changed the style of the building entirely. That's very playful, maybe a little too toy-like. But you can see you get a bunch of other new options. Or you can turn it into a factory building, for example. Like, let's do factory building, classic architecture, red bricks, dark windows, that kind of thing. And within seconds, you have a whole other option here. This looks like a red factory building. This one does. This is a really cool one. It's almost got like kind of a fire department feel here. So 4 other completely new options that you can process just as I showed with the other one and use for a completely different asset perhaps. Or in an opposite process, you can make several different buildings in Blender and use different depth maps, but the same prompt to generate a whole bunch of different homes, hospitals, factories, and so forth for your game. So let's do that real quick. And here are the results. Now, ignore this whole mock-up. I just made this real quick in an image editing program. But all of these little buildings I generated just by tweaking my prompt a little bit and making some rough models in Blender. And most importantly, they fit onto our grid like nobody's business. So that is what makes this method super, super powerful. You can make a ton of different assets in minutes, honestly, and have them all match the angle and perspective. And of course, this can be applied to any sort of style, like this little fantasy mock-up that I made with a little treasure chest and some stuff, and even an interior in the background, which I made just by depth map rendering the inside of a cube with a little window in it. So I hope you get even more creative with this technique. It's super powerful and very fun to play around with. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you learned something, feel free to leave a subscription and a like, and ask any questions you want in the comments. Now, if you really loved this video and want to support my channel as much as you possibly can, I have activated the super thanks button on all of my videos. So thanks to those who've already used it. It's the biggest support you can give me, and I'm super grateful for it. Have fun with Stable Diffusion and Blender.